I'm going to come back to the arrest and jailing of Tommy Robinson later in this video, after I talk about the extent to which the British establishment is complicit in the gang rape of English girls. All I'll say now is that I believe that all those involved in the arrest and kangaroo court jailing of Tommy are guilty of perverting the course of justice, and the only reason this happened is not because Tommy committed a crime, but because he exposed the wicked crimes of the whole rotten, corrupt, stinking British establishment whose job it is to protect the vulnerable and the innocent from harm in Britain. I'm going to go through the various institutions, starting with the police, in order to highlight their failings. Anyone who thinks I'm making these things up, that the good old British establishment couldn't possibly have betrayed so many vulnerable girls for so long, need to read the book entitled Easy Meat by Peter McLaughlin, who forensically details the whole shameful issue around the rape gangs and the British state's refusal to do anything about it. So to the British police, here are a few examples, but there are thousands of others, some chronicled by the Times newspaper's Andrew Norfolk. A 13-year-old girl was found drunk at 3 AM in a derelict house with a large group of adult Muslim males who had plied her with vodka. She was arrested for a public order offence while the men walked free. A 12-year-old girl was branded with the letter M for Mohammed by one of her gang rapists. Another girl was doused with petrol and threatened to be burned alive if she went to the police. She went anyway, but the case file was lost. Another girl's mother sent the names of 177 gang rapists on her daughter's mobile phone to the police, who refused to act because they said it infringed on the men's human rights. 2 girls from South Yorkshire were kidnapped and driven to Bristol to be gang raped. They phoned Somerset and Avon police, who rescued them and put them on a train home, but showed no interest in questioning either them or the gang rapists. West Midlands police were called to a gang rape above a kebab shop, where they did nothing, but they arrested the understandably distraught and angry father of the raped girl for breach of the peace, whilst allowing Mo and his motley mates to toddle off home. Can you believe all of this in England? A parliamentary report in 2013 had to advise the police about the meaning of consent, which again is scarcely believable, but this is what they had to do. They had to actually point out to serving British police officers that a 13-year-old girl was unable to consent to gang rape with 20 Muslim males, in just the same way she was unable to consent to being murdered. This had to be explained to the British police. I could go on and on here because these aren't localised unusual incidents. They've been happening in their hundreds of thousands over a 30-year period, but detailing them would take months and months, so I'll stop here. But it's even worse than this. Not only were the police officers failing to prosecute gang rapists for what they deemed cultural reasons, which basically means fear of being labelled a racist, various chief constables were also pressurising the media not to draw attention to their own failings. Channel 4's documentary Edge of the City, exposing some of these atrocities, was pulled partly because of the pressure from West Yorkshire Chief Constable, who stated there was no evidence to link Pakistani Muslim males with the gang rape of English girls. A lie, of course, but back in 2004, a lie that was lapped up by the BBC et al. All senior police officers from 1970 through to 2012, when the story became too big to contain, were aware of the evils committed under their noses, but all colluded to cover them up. And what finally happened in 2012 to finally break the Muslim gang rape story? EDL demonstrations up and down the country, that's what, led by Tommy Robinson, of course, who pressured the traitor class into finally admitting the truth, which is precisely why the various arms of the British state traitor class hate him so violently. In 2015, the West Midlands police were forced via a Freedom of Information request to admit they had covered up a huge gang rape scandal in 2010 because they feared it would influence the election. Britain's politicised senior police are heavily in favour of the Marxist Labour Party, and because they feared increased support for Tommy's EDL, which was due to stage a march in Dudley about, you guessed it, the state's refusal to deal with the ongoing gang rape problem. So the police were, and still are, complicit. But what of the Crown Prosecution Service, the CPS, that erstwhile body of left-wing zealots tasked with prosecuting abhorrent sexual crimes? Well, that's easy. The CPS was led by Alison Saunders, a crazed, white man-hating harridan who recently had to resign over the hundreds of scandals brought about by her politically driven enthusiasm in prosecuting white men who were, in the main, clearly innocent of all the charges brought against them. This same Alison Saunders, though, this same Crown Prosecution Service, behaves rather differently when the alleged rapists are Muslims. The CPS refused to prosecute a heavily bearded rapist in Telford because his 13-year-old victim had apparently consented, even though she hadn't really wanted to be plied with drink and drugs and then gang raped by Mohammed and his many unwashed pockmarked mates in a filthy bedsit over a kebab shop. But the CPS, which goes out of its way to target white men on the flimsiest of allegations, seems not to understand the obvious point that even if an underage girl does consent, her adult partners are, legally speaking, guilty of a sexual crime. In 2009, Greater Manchester Police arrested 6 Muslims on suspicion of gang raping a young English girl. Their file contained all sorts of corroborating evidence, including the semen of one of the accused found on the girl's pants. The CPS declined to prosecute because, as they stated, the girl was an unreliable witness. The footballer Ched Evans and countless other non-Muslims, hounded by the CPS for alleged rape, must wish they'd been of Pakistani Muslim descent. Such was the desire by the CPS to ignore guilty Muslims completely while gunning for innocent white men instead. And in what must be the worst example of the sheer evil of the Crown Prosecution Service, just listen to this for details of Islamic cultural enrichment and state submission. In 2006, a 12-year-old girl called Samantha was abducted by 2 Muslim men in Oldham, who drove her around for hours before raping her. They then threw her out of the moving car, after which she was picked up by a local Muslim resident, taken upstairs and raped. She escaped while the rapist was calling his friends to come round and rape her as well. A taxi with a passenger then stopped, sympathised with her predicament and offered to take her to the police station. But instead they took her to a house on Attock Close, phoned their friends and then gang raped her for 4 hours. Out of all of these men, only one was prosecuted by the Crown Prosecution Service, and this lone man served a jail sentence of only 3 years, despite guidelines suggesting he should have got at least 11 to 17 years. Appeal judges refused to extend the sentence because serious violence was not used and the girl had consumed alcohol, although whether this was voluntary or not was not considered important. So there you have it, the police, the Crown Prosecution Service and the judiciary all combining in their filthy, repellent behaviour, which brave, moral, decent men like Tommy Robinson sought to expose at tremendous danger to himself. There are countless other examples of the CPS refusing to prosecute Muslim gang rapists, which led to a Government Home Affairs Select Committee report to find the CPS guilty of systemic failures, but which of course failed to suggest what lay behind such repulsive systemic failures. Well, here's a novel idea. Perhaps it's all those Islamists who, for inexplicable reasons, find themselves appointed to advise the Crown Prosecution Service itself. One such CPS advisor is corpulent conman Fiaz Mughal, a mendacious, grievance-mongering takir artist who pudgedly devotes several pages of his Tell Mama website to anti-Tommy Robinson hatred and bile. The main ambition in the life of this Islamist chubster is to jail every critic of Islam. Witness Liberty GB's Tim Burton. Yet Fiyaz Mughal has been elevated by the British state into a position where he's able to do just that. The British Home Office also uses him on matters of anti-Muslim hate crime, despite the fact that he once lost his state funding because he was grossly inflating anti-Muslim hate crime statistics. Can you believe all of this insanity? Another lovable Islamic rogue, Azad Ali, who advocates for the murder of British soldiers, was also an advisor to the CPS and is, of course, a man who hates Tommy Robinson with a vengeance and longs to see him jailed, no matter the innocence of any charges. The Crown Prosecution Service is essentially now a tool of the Islamic world. It is used to silence us. It's complicit in the gang rapes. It's complicit in the cover-up of gang rapes and complicit in the jailing of English dissidents such as Tommy. And so on to the judiciary, which quite astonishingly admits they treat Muslims differently to non-Muslims. Take a look at their insane 421-page advisory book on the purported equal treatment of Muslim defendants in multicultural Britain, which is linked in my pinned comment underneath this video. The British judiciary looks upon Muslims as an oppressed victim class, you see, and thus bends over backwards to appease them. They even admit that in order to treat all races and religions fairly, some must be treated more equally than others, thus undermining in one fell swoop Britain's democratic bedrock of equality before the law. All races and faiths are equal, but some are more equal than others, is now a mantra of the British judiciary, who clearly haven't read Animal Farm. Their cultural Marxist advisory booklet is littered with references to far-left organisations like the Runnymede Trust and Sharia-promoting organisations like the Muslim Council of Britain. The most extraordinary and shameful thing about all of this is that when the British judiciary is confronted with a lone 13-year-old girl being violently gang raped by 20 Muslim men, the men's oppressed status must be considered, while the girl herself will have her white privilege and white oppressor status held against her. Okay, what about those people whose sole job it is to work with the victims of gang rape? The social workers, those paragons of virtue and compassion who bleat endlessly about inequality and domestic violence. Well, I'm sorry to say they did nothing about English girls being gang raped by Muslim men and are thus complicit as well. The social worker industry refused to admit there was a link between Islam and gang rape, so they were reluctant to notify the police for what that was worth, when it turned out that yet again the gang rape gang was Muslims. The handful of social workers who did speak out were fired, which led to child safeguarding officers and councillors of local councils to also remain mute about the greatest crime of the 21st century. Indeed, it now transpires that some councillors were actually indulging in a spot of gang rape themselves. So the safeguarding officers, the social workers and the councillors themselves were complicit in all of this. What about the journalists? The BBC knew about this nationwide Muslim gang rape issue for years, but declined to tell us about it because, well, because Muslims, brown, oppressed, etc. Local newspaper journalists knew all about it, were told to keep quiet or lose their jobs. British journalists are explicitly instructed by the National Union of Journalists Guidelines to avoid any negative reporting about incidents when the perpetrators are from an ethnic or religious minority, but to do the exact opposite in terms of smearing right-wing racists, as they put it. There's a link to the NUJ guidelines in my pinned comment again, and with no sense of shame, the NUJ advises journalists to check with certain organisations as to whether some people, like me, or some political parties, are racist or Islamophobes and can thus be ignored or smeared. And would you like to know what these organisations are? These organisations the NUJ consider worthy of their opinions. One is the communist organisation Searchlight, another the paramilitary communist bootboy organisation Unite Against Fascism, and also the communist organisation Hope Not Hate. It's only when you read these guidelines that you realise why the traitor class journalists remain mute for decades. British journalism is dead. It's bought and paid for by subversives who hate Britain, democracy, capitalism and white people, but who love anything non-British as long as it undermines and destroys traditional Britain and its native people. Even Muslim gang rapists, it would seem. And since the reporting restrictions on Tommy's arrest were lifted, every single British media outlet has come out against him. Not a single one has questioned the bizarrely totalitarian circumstances around his jailing, and not a single article telling us all about how Tommy got what he deserved is open to comments, for obvious reasons of course, including one in The Guardian by that simpering, ghastly little communist pipsqueak Owen Jones. So come on, Jones, open the comments and try to defend your indefensible position, you obscene gang rape apologist. Leeds Live, an online newspaper, even went as far as publishing Tommy's home address in the full knowledge there are credible death threats from the religion of peace against Tommy's wife and children. The journalists involved in this foul act of political hatred are called Stephanie Finnegan, Matt Millington and Charlotte Tobit, all of whom are now receiving online abuse whilst congratulating themselves on their bravery in facing up to it. But here's the thing, you murderous left-wing filth. The abuse is aimed at you for the terrible thing you have done, and none of you will actually be decapitated by anyone, whilst Tommy's children really are at risk courtesy of what you have done. Putting the lives of innocent children in very real danger is not something you should be proud of. But then again, if you weren't proud of it, you probably wouldn't be left-wing members of our traitor class, would you? So, the police, the judiciary, the social workers, the Crown Prosecution Service and the journalists are all complicit, not only in Muslim gang rape itself, but complicit also in silencing anyone who draws attention to the nationwide epidemic of Muslim gang rape. So what's left? Where can we turn? To our politicians? Well, sorry, no, they're complicit as well. Labour MP for Rotherham, Dennis McShane, said he knew about the Muslim gang rapes, but didn't say anything because he didn't want to rock the multicultural boat, as he so shamefully put it. And one hopes there is a special place in hell reserved for Mr McShane, who really should be imprisoned for aiding and abetting the atrocities carried out. But he isn't, is he? Tommy is, instead, for exposing the atrocities. What a truly screwed up left-wing country Britain has become. Sarah Champion, the MP who replaced McShane in Rotherham, was given the role of Minister for Preventing Abuse in the Labour Party shadow cabinet of Jeremy Corbyn in 2015, and in 2016 was appointed to the role of Shadow Minister for Women and Equalities. It all sounds hopeful, doesn't it? But in 2017, Jeremy Corbyn forced her to resign after she wrote an article for the Sun newspaper in which she discussed the problem of, quote, white girls being raped and exploited by British Pakistani men, unquote, which fellow Labour MP and surreal anti-Semite Naz Shah described as incendiary and irresponsible. But it's true, though. No, Ms. Shah, it's true. Can you believe this? The woman tasked with safeguarding English girls from predatory gangs of Muslim gang rapists is fired because she talks about Muslim gang rapists. But there's a reason for this monstrosity. The Labour Party is dependent on the Muslim vote, so the Labour Party will never help underage gang-raped English girls, ergo the Labour Party is also complicit. Which leads us to our last potential avenue of decency, morality and democracy, the Conservative Party. But this is a party headed up by a uselessly weak woman who has now given one of the great offices of state to a Muslim. Sajid Javid is now Britain's Home Secretary and thus controls the police and the judiciary. We're told he's a jolly good sort of Muslim, virtually an ex-Muslim in fact, a man who has little time for Islam on the whole, but Sajid Javid could well be a Muslim Trojan horse. After all, he blatantly lied about receiving a Punish a Muslim Day letter that has never been investigated for this unusual act of Islamic taqiyya. And watch Home Secretary Javid take his oath of allegiance in Parliament here.
I swear by Almighty God that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, her heirs and successors, according to law, so help me God.
Did you notice how he whispered his request for the Quran? Did you notice how the clerk asked him to personally pick it up rather than hand it to him in the same manner she handed the Bible to Theresa May at the same ceremony? This is because she's a filthy infidel, you see, and cannot defile the Holy Quran with her rabid ape-like digits. And we allow this to happen in Parliament. We allow a Muslim Home Secretary in England to swear his oath of allegiance on an alien book filled with orders to dominate all non-Muslims, and only days after this Muslim is appointed British Home Secretary, our democratic foundations are overridden and Tommy is jailed at the speed of light. Tommy, a man whose only crime is doing the job our establishment is supposed to do in terms of protecting vulnerable English girls. I ask again, can you believe all of this? If you're watching this in another country, I'm afraid it is all true though, even if it is beyond all rational and moral comprehension, as it so surely is. And now back to the arrest and jailing of Tommy. Was his arrest lawful? No, it was not. He was arrested for a breach of the peace, which clearly he was not engaging in. His unlawful arrest was ordered by Judge Geoffrey Marson QC, who then found him guilty of contempt of court in less than 4 minutes, which means the 1 hour video streamed by Tommy, which was the only evidence available in order to find him guilty of contempt of court, was not watched by the judge at all. The police lied to Tommy's lawyer. They claimed he had been released, so she didn't have to rush to represent him. Tommy's stand-in lawyer advised him to plead guilty because his only punishment would be a fine. The lawyer knew this was a lie. Tommy's suspended sentence was only for 3 months, yet Judge Geoffrey added another 10 months to this. Why? Several other people were also filming outside Leeds Crown Court, but none of them were arrested, only Tommy. Why? Was he really guilty of contempt of court? Did he really jeopardise the trial? Of course he didn't. Everything he stated was already in the public domain, some of it from the BBC themselves. The video stream he made is still available to watch on YouTube. If it was really true that references contained within it could jeopardise the trial, why hasn't Judge Geoffrey ordered it to be taken down? Judge Geoffrey is clearly prejudiced against Tommy. He had it within his power to order the press not to release Tommy's home address. He chose not to, in the full knowledge there are credible death threats against Tommy's children. Judge Geoffrey ordered the unlawful arrest. He unlawfully imprisoned Tommy and then issued an immediate gagging order in order to enable his imprisonment without public outcry. All of this amounts to a lack of due process and to perverting the course of justice, doesn't it? Something that perhaps the British media and human rights lawyers might just be interested in, but no, zero interest there, despite the whole British state acting like Lavrenti Beria, Joseph Stalin's chief of the NKVD secret police, who once stated, "Show me the man and I will find you the crime." Tommy's purported crime was not really contempt of court at all. Tommy was doing no more than the BBC, ITV, Sky News, etc. did at the trials of Rolf Harris and Max Clifford, Ched Evans and scores of other white men accused of rape. The only difference with Tommy was that he was covering the trial of Muslims, which, as I've said before, is something our traitor class don't want us to know about in case we stop celebrating diversity and instead get seriously angry about our ongoing cultural enrichment. This totalitarian kangaroo court travesty has happened only because Tommy has been drawing attention to the horrific failings by every organ of the British state which has a duty to protect our children and has so manifestly failed to do. Tommy's other crime, of course, is that he's working class. Our left-wing intellectual middle-class establishment, which constantly squeals about the importance of a classless society, actually hates the working class with a passion. Unless they're brown, black or Muslim, of course. They hate the fact that Tommy Robinson, as a journalist, has a far greater following than any of them could ever hope to garner. They hate the fact that he's helping to derail their subversive big lie of what they publicly state as a multicultural utopia, but which they privately admit is just a means of using ethnic and religious minorities as pawns in their war against traditional Britain, no matter how much harm they cause amongst innocent, vulnerable English girls. These people are obscene, and one measure of their obscenity is their silence over the gang rape of working class girls, because, as we all know, if it was their daughters, if it were the Arabellas and Sarah Janes being raped by Muslims on an industrial scale, there is no way on earth they would have remained silent for decades. These people are wicked and evil. They are, and I use these words advisedly, the scum of the earth, morally depraved left-wing filth. So, I accuse the British police and the British judiciary of perverting the course of justice. I accuse the government, the politicians and the journalists of being complicit in the gang rape of vulnerable English girls and in helping pervert the course of justice. And should Tommy get killed in prison, I will accuse them all of being complicit in his deliberate, calculated murder. Never before have I been so ashamed of my country, and never before have I seen and heard so many people, not just in Britain, but all around the world, saying the same thing. Allowing the gang rapes to continue unhindered for 3 decades was shameful enough, but now I see Britain being held up by the rest of the free world as a dirty, corrupt, totalitarian country which has willfully destroyed its moral and democratic foundations. This is heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking, but thankfully it is driving people to a righteous moral rage, and if there can be one single silver cloud in this obscene and tawdry debacle, it is surely that. Decent people being driven to a moral rage. I can only hope this is the beginning of a long overdue revolution against our entire degenerate traitor class. Jailing Tommy might just turn out to be the straw that broke the back of the long-suffering British, even if our traitor class are too cretinously stupid and too obscenely arrogant to recognise it today.